Song of Solomon chapter 4. We left off last time at verse 3, and the bridegroom is describing his bride. And he says in verse 3, "Thy temples are like a piece of pomegranate within thy locks." And the bridegroom says the same thing again in chapter 6, verse 7. "As a piece of a pomegranate are thy temples within thy locks." The pomegranate was the fruit represented on the robe of the high priest. And we won't turn to it. It's described back in Exodus 28, verses 33 and 34. And also depicted on the two main pillars outside the temple. Later on, 1 Kings chapter 7. And it was one of the fruits used to describe the prosperity of the promised land when the spies came back. It's Deuteronomy 8, verse 8, "A land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of oil, olive, and honey." And he's using the pomegranate to describe the bride's temples below her hair, or beneath her hair, on the sides here, as something to be desired. This is how he was describing a beautiful woman that he saw. Verse 4 says, "Thy neck is as the tower of David." And he says in chapter 7, verse 4, "Thy neck is as a tower of ivory." And the idea here is strength. It says, "Builded for an armory, whereon there hang 1,000 bucklers, all shields of mighty men." The strength of David, from a human standpoint, was his armory, and all of the weapons he had in reserve at his disposal as a king. And here the 1,000 bucklers are defined as all shields of mighty men. A buckler was a small shield that was held by leather straps on the back. And Ezekiel 39 and verse 9 makes the distinction between large and small shields. It says there, both the shields and the bucklers. So there were two different types of shields. A smaller one referred to as a buckler. And no doubt the picture here is linked with the chains of gold around the neck of the bride. Look back at chapter 1. And verse 10 said, "Thy cheeks are comely with rows of jewels, thy neck with chains of gold." And also chapter 4, verse 9. "Thou hast ravished my heart, my sister, my spouse, thou hast ravished my heart with one of thine eyes, with one chain of thy neck." And this doesn't sound flattering to a modern woman. She doesn't want to be told she has a thick neck. But 100 years ago, 200 years ago, you see paintings or statues depicting beautiful women, and they're always full-figured gals. More often than they weren't the skinny stick figures that are modern-day models. Not at all. They had some meat on their bones. Pleasantly plump. Although you don't want to get too pleasant about it, or too plump. Verse 5. Verse 5 in our text says, "Thy two breasts are like two young roes that are twins, which feed among the lilies." The roe is another name for a gazelle. That's merely an intimate description of her physical form, and there's no need to dwell on it. I think everybody knows what he's describing in her body. Verses 6 through 8. Let's move on. "Until the day break and the shadows flee away, I will get me to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. Thou art all fair, my love, there is no spot in thee. Come with me from Lebanon, my spouse, with me from Lebanon. Look, from the top of Amana, from the top of Shinir and Hermon, from the lions' dens, from the mountains of the leopards." And now we're back to the image of the rapture. Verse 6, "Until the day break." That's the second advent. Malachi 4, verse 2 says, "But unto you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings, and he shall go forth and grow up as calves of the stall." He also says there in verse 6, "And the shadows flee away." Turn forward, if you will, to the book of Zephaniah. Zephaniah chapter 1. That's a small book, Zephaniah 1. Zephaniah 1, notice there verses 14 and 15. The great day of the Lord is near, it is near and hasteth greatly. Even the voice of the day of the Lord, the mighty man shall cry there bitterly. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of wasteness and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness. That's a picture of the tribulation. The shadows flee away. And when they're gone, when that time is over, then the day dawns once again. So until the tribulation, and until the second advent of the Lord Jesus Christ, the bridegroom has gotten himself, as the verse says, to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. There in verse 6. That's a reference to heaven, if you want. Go back to Psalm 45. Psalm 45. Psalm 45, and notice there, verse 8. All thy garments smell of myrrh, and aloes, and cassia, out of the ivory palaces, whereby they have made thee glad. Also, I think chapter 48, verse 3, God is known in her palaces for refuge. Well, but all of thy garments smell of myrrh and cassia, the psalmist says. And verse 7 in our text, thou art all fair, my love, there is no spot in thee. That's the condition of the bride, of the church, after the judgment seat of Christ. But it's not the condition of the church now. Look at Ephesians chapter 5, the New Testament. Ephesians 5. Ephesians 5, notice there, verse 27. Paul writes that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. But that's not true about the church yet. And if it were true, Paul wouldn't see the need to warn us about the works of the flesh back in Galatians chapter 1. But he does. And the church will eventually be without spot and without wrinkle, but it's not that way now. He says in verse 7 of our text, thou art all fair, my love. She's completely clean. And at the rapture, you get a new body. Philippians 3:21 says, who shall change our vile body that may be fashioned like unto his glorious body, according to the working whereby he is able even to subdue all things unto himself. And 1 John 3:2, when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. So you get a new body like the glorified body of the Lord Jesus, but it's still not completely without spot, without wrinkle, until your works as a Christian have been tested at the judgment seat of Christ. Go forward, if you will, to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. 1 Corinthians 3. I suppose this is a truth that has probably very seldom been observed and Christians reminded of. We think that at the rapture we'll get the new bodies and everything will be great from that time on, but there's still the judgment seat of Christ. That's something very few Christians have thought through, and very few pastors have ever paused to remind them of. But look at 1 Corinthians 3, and start there at verse 13. Every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire. And the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. If any man's work abide, which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive a reward. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. So that's something every Christian should bear in mind. When he describes his bride without spot and blemish, and he says there in verse 7, "Thou art all fair, my love, there is no spot in thee." That's the ideal, but it's not the present condition of the church now. And then verse 8 in our text, he says, "Come with me." That's another invitation to the rapture, from the bridegroom to the bride. And he says much the same thing in chapter 2, verse 10. "My beloved spake and said unto me, Rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away." And also verse 13. "The fig tree putteth forth her green figs, and the vines with the tender grape give a good smell. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away." When he says in verse 8, "from Lebanon," he is the one coming from Lebanon to get her. And the next three places listed in the verse, Amana, Shinir, and Hermon. And all three of those places are in the land of Lebanon. Today, the state of the country of Lebanon is just north of the state of Israel, also along the Mediterranean coast. It's actually smaller. The country of Lebanon now is actually smaller than the state of Israel. And then north of Israel and east of Lebanon is the country of Syria. I was thinking before we got started tonight, how many of these places are 3,000 years old and they still exist. And we're still reading about them in the daily newspaper. Funny how none of the places in the Book of Mormon still exist. None of the great cities where the Jews once lived here in America exist. Oh, I mean, they've named cities after cities that are found in the Book of Mormon. I think there's a town in Utah called Bountiful. That's one of the cities in the Book of Mormon. But they have no real history to them. And then all three of those places are in the land of Lebanon. And Solomon had a house in the forest of Lebanon. 1 Kings 7, verse 2. It says, "He built also the house of the forest of Lebanon." Amana is the northernmost city, at least of these three, in the country of Lebanon. It means truth or a settled position. Today, Amana is the name of a company that sells refrigerators and freezers and ice boxes, and big refrigeration corporation. All over the world they have their products. Hermon and Shinir are two names for the same place. Go, if you will, to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 3. Deuteronomy 3. Notice there it says in verse 9, well, we'll start at verse 8. Deuteronomy 3, verse 8. "And we took at that time out of the hand of the two kings of the Amorites the land that was on this side Jordan, from the river of Arnon unto Mount Hermon, which Hermon the Sidonians call Sirion, and the Amorites call it Shinir." So Hermon and Shinir are named for the same place. And also look at Deuteronomy 4, verse 48. Deuteronomy 4:48. "From Aroer, which is by the bank of the river Arnon, even unto Mount Sion, which is Hermon." So Hermon is also known as Sion in the northern part of Lebanon. Not to be confused with Zion. But just coinky-dinky, Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. In the New Testament, Hebrews 12 and verse 22 says our home in heaven is there, our heavenly mother called New Jerusalem. Hebrews 12 verse 22, Paul writes, "But ye are come unto Mount Sion, and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels." God uses these towns, these cities, in the the imagery, and it's between the bridegroom and the bride, is for our benefit the image of Christ calling to his bride, the church, come away, and he's going to rescue her. And once the darkness and the night is past, the morning will come. That'll be after the tribulation, and we come back with him to rule over the world with him. And Mount Zion is included in the description here, or found in the description here of Hermon and Shinir, also known as Mount Zion. And our heavenly home is said to be in Mount Zion, not Mount Zion as another name for the physical Jerusalem. And there are two commands in verse 8 of our text. Let me turn back there. I'm just about done for tonight. Two commands in verse 8. Come with me, that's one command, from Lebanon, my spouse with me from Lebanon. Look from the top of Ammon, that's the second command, to come and to look. From the top of Shinir and Hermon, from the lion's dens, from the mountains of the leopards. Christ, look if you will at Revelation 5. About all we can do is make devotional application for much of this. And that is Revelation 5, verse 5. And one of the elders saith unto me, Weep not, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, hath prevailed to open the book and to loose the 7 seals thereof. And also verse 10, and has made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. So Christ is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. You and I, glorified with him, are made like him. So you can see the lions plural in the text. And it says leopards also in verse 8. You can find the Antichrist showing up in the midst of all that as well. Revelation 13, who is like a leopard. And that might be kind of weak, but that's all right. We'll stop right there.